666.
Three noteworthy developments in the U.S. Saudi G2G relationship taking place this week. I wanted to kind of run through them. First, a flurry of reported diplomatic activity involving the transfer of two islands. The Tiran and Sanafir islands from Egypt to Saudi Arabia may lead ultimately to normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Those talks are being brokered by diplomats from the Biden administration, according to a report by Axios. Either way, it is an achievement for the Biden administration just in playing a role in those talks. And of course, it would be a significant foreign policy win for the Biden administration if it does lead to a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So there's that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, Richard, later in today's show, since we think it deserves its own discussion. Second is a visit by three Republican members of Congress to Saudi Arabia this week, which included a meeting directly with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Chris Stewart from Utah, Guy Reschenthaler from Pennsylvania, and Lisa McClain from Michigan all met directly with the Crown Prince. And Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States, Princess Rima bint Bandar, also attended along with former ambassador and Minister of State Adel Al-Jubeir. No meaningful details were released from the meeting, of course, but it's still very interesting that it took place. And third, still not a done deal yet, but another Axios report said this week that top Biden officials are also in Saudi Arabia for broader talks, including to arrange for a potential visit by the president to Saudi Arabia in June, which would be huge. Three current and former U.S. officials told Axios that two of President Biden's senior advisors are on a, quote, secret visit to Saudi Arabia for talks about not only reportedly secret, about not only the islands transfer that I just mentioned, but also a deal to increase oil production and Washington and Riyadh's bilateral relationship. According to the report, President Biden is considering visiting Saudi Arabia as part of his planned trip to the Middle East at the end of June. Getting a package of understandings between the United States and Saudi Arabia on these issues is crucial for the visit to take place, the sources told Axios. Taking a step back, Richard, what we're looking at here is clearly no longer the low point in U.S.-Saudi relations in recent years that we just saw. Some would say that we reached it earlier this year in 2022 as oil prices surged and the Saudis reportedly would not take President Biden's phone call. Just an opinion here, but I think that narrative in the media today that the president, quote, promised to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah on the campaign trail as being a huge problem for Saudi Arabia is not really the issue. I think Saudi leaders know that U.S. politicians say things they don't mean all the time, such as the nature of democratic elections. I mean, President Trump absolutely blasted the Saudis on several occasions on the campaign trail before his surprise election win. And even as President Trump said, he told King Salman that, quote, we're protecting you. You might not be there for 2 weeks without us. You have to pay for your military, which is hard to even address as a statement because of it's both wholly inaccurate and offensive. But Richard, I think talk is cheap, and the Trump administration had a closer relationship with Saudi Arabia despite Trump's bluster and outbursts. Saudi Arabia was his first trip overseas, as you remember. And when U.S. officials visited Saudi Arabia, they weren't doing so in secret, as the Axios report said. So what I think actually matters is not words, but actions. President Biden said what he said on the campaign trail, but what really matters is his actions. He wouldn't engage with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman at all before he had his back against the wall with oil prices. And so we love highlighting our themes on this podcast, Richard. And I think one of them is that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is so deep and rooted that there is almost a disassociation now, or it feels like one, between the political relationship as viewed through the media and the actual ties between the countries. And that's why I highlighted these stories this week. The U.S.-Saudi military relationship is still very strong. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia still have shared defense and security interests. U.S. businesses have helped build and grow the kingdom over the decades and still do. And culturally, the two nations have a long history, and many Saudis, especially the hundreds of thousands who studied here in the U.S., consider the U.S. a second home. So, Richard, we'll just have to see what happens next year with the Biden visit, the islands transfer, which, again, we'll talk about in a little bit. But there's a lot of momentum now, and it sort of seems like that low point is far behind us.
Well, they're never far away. That's the nature of these things, and
True.
Some global circumstance will force a point of contention. But that's a big one. That's a good one. You covered a lot more in there. And yeah, we'll hold off on the Sanafir and Tiran island business for the Yella. It was interesting. The members of Congress who arrived in Riyadh to visit with Mohammed bin Salman, not surprisingly, are all from the Republican Party, which speaks to an issue that President Biden has, which is, its own party is particularly vocal in criticism about Saudi Arabia. So, he has to deal with that. And I agreed. I think we do make a frequent point that at the institutional level, things proceed and the relationship is tended to and often strengthened. We have had a political impasse. I think it's interesting, and you make a fair point that the Saudis are always in play during the campaign season, and the Saudis are aware of this. And way back they used to be offended by it. I think when they were less media savvy, over time they sort of realized it was just words. Mm-hmm. And yes, Donald Trump has been as equally critical as anybody else. I think it's interesting that the Biden comment, which you may recall that Dave DeRoche sort of did a etymology of pariah, and that it was particularly offensive in Saudi Arabia and to the Crown Prince. But beyond that, I think the Saudis genuinely not happy with Biden's behavior and the support with Yemen, the response to Houthi attacks, and any number of issues. But I wonder too if this isn't a little bit of a new situation where the Saudis are not so comfortable with just taking it on the cheek, taking it on the chin every campaign season. And then maybe if, you just shouldn't be, if you're a candidate, okay, you're going to speak to your domestic base and say whatever, but maybe you should show a little bit of discipline if you understand the relationship. So I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it in line with what we mentioned earlier about Saudis showing more confidence, feeling they're more of a global player. And I think, frankly, deserve greater attention from the U.S. Across a number of topics, maybe less patient with this sort of behavior during a campaign season. Maybe not, but this is interesting that this one really got them and really irritates them.
Yeah, I mean, in U.S. elections, candidates just say whatever they want, and it's
and do,
and it's sort of uncomfortable for us as Americans to just admit that, because it is frustrating. I think for both of us, just as citizens of America, that there's just during campaign seasons, and we're in a midterm election year this year. Candidates will just say whatever they want, and usually about Saudi Arabia, it's easier to score a cheap political victory. I mean, right now it's about oil. 10 to 15 years ago, it was about security and terrorism. And it plays to a broader ignorance in the United States about Saudi Arabia. And that's part of what we're doing here, Richard, is we're trying to have a real conversation that is not, based in hyperbole or, is not just the top level, analysis of what's going on between the United States and Saudi Arabia, but the actual stuff, the G to G, the B to B, all that stuff going on between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. We're trying to just talk about it. And so it's interesting. I guess I don't have a point that I'm really making here. I'm quite cynical about those things. So,
I agree with it. It is embarrassing. Our political discourse is so degraded, going to the lowest common denominator, just dealing in grievance and mostly and with no basis in fact. And it is embarrassing. And to be honest, the Saudis and other countries, there was a recent poll in Canada that the Canadians are really worried about what's going on in Saudi Arabia, why we can't communicate. And the political discourse is so negative and so unconstructive. Saudi Arabia, I think, feels the same way. Anybody who's paying close attention, they're as worried about what's going on inside the U.S. as what we are attempting to or endeavoring to do in the foreign policy environment. So it's a real concern, not only for us, but globally.
Yeah, we'll have to see what happens with the visit if it comes to pass. I don't know much about Biden's planned visit elsewhere in the Middle East or where he's going. But I mean, if I were president, I would visit Saudi Arabia, and I think that it's you don't always. I mean, I'm maybe a little biased, maybe
unless unless you put yourself in a hole by calling them pariah, which is just we know.
Right.
And the absurdity of this is, and it's not that there aren't issues with Saudi Arabia, and I don't want to go on a rant here, but, and it's not anything you don't know, but, you have real issues with Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights and other deficiencies that we perceive. But to call it, the double standard is so striking for Saudis. I mean, if you're willing to meet with Recep Erdogan and Vladimir Putin, and Sung-Young, no, I'm sorry, the head of North Korea, President Xi, all of these people, Joe Biden would meet with. Mm-hmm. And you don't really come off looking well by saying, oh, look, we're not so bad because they're worse. And that's not the point I'm making, because they all are worse than Saudi Arabia in terms of misbehavior and human rights abuses. So Saudi Arabia can't hide behind that. But their point is, if you're going to meet with them, it's hypocritical and double standard to be unwilling to meet with us.
Mm-hmm. And when you're a head of state, you say what you say to get elected, but then your job is to govern and to deal with the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are strong allies below the surface. Even if you don't like Saudi Arabia, even if you have a personal problem with Saudi Arabia, the reality is that your country has a lot of trade with Saudi Arabia. Oil prices are high now. So like Saudi Arabia controls, not controls, but is the most important member in the OPEC plus cartel that includes Russia. I mean, it's just a complex world. So to have a very simple way of approaching it and say, look, we're just not going to deal with them, do so at your own peril, in my opinion.
I want to add one more thing while we're on this rant.
Mm-hmm. We love rants here, by the way. This is a rant-friendly podcast.
On the reporting about the Sanafir and Tiran Islands and other things, they refer to normalization of relationship with Israel. It's way too early, and this is sort of Western media, their hopes and their dreams. This is not what is in play here. They are talking. Hopefully, they are talking. But when we get into it, we'll see why they are talking. Normalization of Israel, and from the Israeli perspective, they love to hear that language. Israel for years have always said, we'll fly anywhere. We'll fly to Egypt. We'll fly to Saudi Arabia. Of course they will, because it's just by act of doing it means they've been recognized. So they basically gain something by giving nothing. And this is where we are now. I mean, if, Saudi Arabia and King Salman in particular has said, we have to have real movement on occupied territories and vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And Israel is not willing to do this, and they won't be doing this.
Yeah.
So eventually some sort of relationship will evolve, and we'll see what it is. But this is not normalization of relations with Israel just yet.